Dear friends, welcome back to another session of Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology and the Ganga Jamni Heritage Series, which is on reflections on our shared past. We once again would be discussing Braj Bhoomi and the Mughals, like we did in the past. But today, we will try to go further and delve into Mughal Bhakti itself. We know that the cult of not only Krishna but also Ram started growing from the reign of Akbar onwards. Both Tulsi and Surdas were the contemporaries of Akbar. As Acharya Sri Vats Goswami last week told us, it was a Goswami of the Chaitanya order, Sri Jiva Goswami, who called Akbar as Sriman Akbara Mahan. Govindev temple was created as a result of the collaborations between the Mughals, the Goswamis, and the Rajputs. Akbar allowed the use of red sandstone, usually reserved for imperial use for its construction. And it was built by Raja Man Singh in the image of any other contemporary royal structures. In a very recently published book, Braj, Bhoom in Mughal times, based on primary documents which were prepared during the 16th century onwards by the Mughals, written in both Braj and Persian, the authors Irfan Habib and late Tarapat Mukherjee elaborate on this type of interactions and show how it shaped in the foundation of a new society and social relations. Irfan Habib not only throws light on the Mughal administration and how it dealt with multiplicity, but also comments on the land rights and land control in these areas. Today, to further elaborate on this topic and make us understand our common past, we have with us Professor John Stratton Hawley, with whom we are going to discuss Braj Bhoom and Mughal Bhakti. Professor John Stratton Hawley is Clare Thorpe Professor of Religion at Barnard College, Columbia University. He joined Barnard's faculty in 1986. His research is focused on the religious life of North India and on the literature that it has spawned in the course of the last 500 years. Professor Hawley is undoubtedly one of the foremost scholars of leading saints of North Indian Bhakti traditions from 1450 to around 1650, especially of Surdas, the 16th century poet and singer and Krishna devotee par excellence. Jack, as I am told he likes to be called, has served as director of Columbia University South Asia Institute and has received multiple awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian, and the American Institute of Indian Studies. He has also been a Guggenheim Fellow and was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2016-17, he was a Fulbright Nehru Fellow, principally resident in Vrindavan, not far from Delhi, and the place about which we would be talking today. He is the author or editor of some 25 books. Most of these books are concerned with Hinduism and the religions of India, but others are broadly comparative. Recent publications include A Storm of Songs, India and the Idea of Bhakti Movement, Another book of his, which he did along with Kenneth Bryant, Sur's Ocean, Poems from Early Tradition. Both these books were published from the Harvard University Press around 2015. The latter volume has been published as part of the very impressive Murthy Classical Library of India series, edited by Professor Sheldon Pollock. Each of his work won an award from the Association for Asian Studies. Recently, with the publication of a revised and expanded version of Surdas, has been published in India by Primus Books. This monograph includes a 100-page chapter based on visual material from late 17th and early 18th century Udaipur. More recently, we can say that at the start of this year 2020, another book of Professor Hole was published, and that is Krishna's Background, Vrindavan in the 21st Century, which was published by the Oxford University Press, possibly, if I'm not wrong, in January 2020. With this brief introduction, let us welcome Professor Hole. John, welcome to the show. We have, in fact, been impatiently waiting. Last week, we had Srivats Goswami ji, who initiated this dialogue about the Braj Bhoom. Let me also, Professor Hole, tell you that actually, when we visualized this program, we had thought that first of all, we would have Professor Habib, and later on, we would have Goswami ji and yourself to discuss about the book. But unfortunately, due to the ongoing pandemic, we could not have Professor Habib on the show, and we promised to our viewers that ultimately, when the situation improves a little, we would surely be having to discuss. But then, I would like to ask you about your opinion about the book which has been published by Professor Irfan Habib and Tharapat Mukherjee. What is your assessment about this book? How would you rate it?
Well, first of all, let me say good morning to you, though I know it's good evening in India. Here in New York, it's very much morning, although the noon bell has just rung, and it's a very great privilege to be here. It's the first time, actually, Professor Rezvi, that I'm having a chance to meet you, though I've known your writings for a while, and it's an enormous privilege. It's a great privilege to be a part of this series, and I'm very glad to hear that Irfan Habib himself is going to be appearing, because that is indeed the moment to be waiting for most of all. I did have a chance to see parts of last week's interview with Srivats Goswami, who has been my mentor for, gosh, all of my significant life. That's to say the part that has to do with India. And it's an embarrassment to be following him. We know that the lesser performers should be the alap to the great ones. And somehow the order has been reversed. But for this reason, I'm very pleased to hear that Professor Irfan Habib will be coming afterward. That means at least that I can be alap in some meaningful sense. So thank you so much for this invitation. And it's just, it's a miracle of this time that we're able to talk in this medium at all. There may be some technical difficulties along the way, but we'll try to take those in stride. Now, let me just say something about this remarkable book published by Primus, who, as you know, and as you heard, have also published one of mine, Braj Bhoom in Mughal times. Irfan Habib and Tharapat Mukherjee changed the landscape of the historical study of the Braj region in ways that are just almost impossible to imagine that this could have happened. Last week, Sridhar Goswami told you the story of how he acted as an intermediary between Tarapad and Irfan, and he mentioned also that Monica Horstman was a part of this trio. It's one of the great stories of scholarship. The book is just amazing, and it's amazing in more than one way. First of all, you think of a book like this, which draws on earlier materials, lectures, as Sridhar was saying last week, that Irfan Nabi presented to the Indian Historical Congress, principally, but also other articles which have appeared elsewhere. One thinks that, oh, this is going to be a book that just gives you those prior articles all in one cover. And it does do that. But there's much more. All you have to do is turn to the first page of this book, the first page of chapter 1, and which is called Braj Bhoom in Mughal times. And if you compare it with the earlier form, which was delivered to the Indian Historical Congress, you will find on the very first page that Irfan Sahab has actually expanded his discussion so that you're not just reading what he presented to the audience in Goa back in, I think, 1987, perhaps it was, but rather he's gone back into the text to expand it and turn this volume into something that is very much a volume of our time. It's a register, especially of his work, over now decades and decades and decades. We know that he has trained a whole school of historians, but here we get to see Irfan Habib himself. And as Sridhar was saying last week, in a medium that he never would have imagined, but that has completely changed our sense of the history of the Braj region. I would say the principal authority that one had before the appearance of this work and this book was Prabhodayal Mittal's remarkable book, Braj Sampradayam Ka Itihas, and other works that have to do with the Braj country particularly. But what Prabhodayalji did not have access to was the Mughal records, which we find so eloquently, how shall I say, translated for us, transcribed for us in this book. Now these riches are available to anyone who can manage to get a copy of this book. It changes we are beyond the school of history that has sometimes in my hearing been called the Kaha Jata Hai school of history. This is not Kaha Jata Hai. This is a history that is being inferred from written sources which take us right back to the time at which these events occurred in the 16th and following centuries. The fact that Irfan and Tarapaji, whom I did not know in person, have made this available to us is really one of the, historically speaking, one of the wonders of the 20th century. And I hope we'll have a chance to see why it matters in present time. Yes, this is a historical exercise, but history matters because history is always being drawn upon in the present day to give us a sense of where we come from and what it all means. We can't say that these are the facts. These are the facts as were recorded in the time when these events happen, but they are facts in a fundamental way that we just haven't had access to before. I live in a country where our president, I use the name in quotes, is constantly saying that the facts which are quoted by the worthwhile press, the press that cares to know things, are not facts. But they are facts. Facts matter. It really makes a difference whether we're able to see back into what was going on in the 16th century when Braj, as we know it today, was actually created. We owe that to the remarkable discoveries of the library of Jiva Goswami as they came into the Vrindavan Research Institute, as then discovered by Tarapadji, and then messengered by Surivatsji to Irfan Sahib, and then all of this work which has followed. So it's just an amazing thing and a matter of huge honor to me to be able simply to say it before the rest of you. I know that many of you have followed the work of these great historians through the years, so it's just a chance that I'm the person who is able to say it. But please let me say it from afar, because I think the implications of this work are indeed implications that are felt very far afield from Braj Bhoom itself. They have to do with a view of the past, which shows us a complex society being formed with all kinds of actors, not anyone's majoritarian view of what the past ought to look like. Rather, okay, maybe I should stop there. I see you've just come on screen once again, Professor.
Very rightly pointed out by you that the book is actually very, very important for us because it, bases on the primary source material, which nobody can negate. As you rightly pointed out, that it is not that such and such person said so. It is very much there in the document, and no one can negate that. Now, there is one question, Professor Hole, which I would like to ask you regarding this work, and that is that there are two types of documents which are there for Vrindavan. One which are in Braj, the other which are in Persian. Naturally, Irfan Habib would have been dealing with the Persian documents. You might have gone through the Braj documents yourself. Do you find any variance between the two type of documents, or both the type of documents talk about the same matters in a similar fashion?
Well, when you refer to the Braj documents, what do you mean?
The documents which are not in Persian, but those which are there in the local language, in the script which is done.
Well, as Professor Habib explains, let me come to a second part of that in a moment. As he explains, when a legal document was created in Persian, there was often the obligation to create a translation or a version of that document so that people who were ordinary people, these are the people whom Irfan cared about for his whole scholarly career, so that those people could understand what was said. So often they were simplifications of the kind of text that you would get in Persian, which was a lawyerly text intended to be read by, so to speak, khas log. So there's that much of a difference. But the kinds of documents that I've been concerned with are actually rather different from any of that. They are written in Brajbhasha and until a certain point in time in the Devanagari script. And they have to do with collections of poetry which were made in this time. So that's quite a different kind of document altogether. For Surdas, whose name you mentioned, the earliest source that we have is a manuscript that was created at Fatehpur, actually, so up in the Shekhawati region of modern-day Rajasthan, for someone who is connected with the Kachwaha court at then Amer, would become Jaipur. So those are very different kinds of manuscripts, legal documents on the one hand, and poetry, or perhaps lives of the poets on the other. Two very different kinds of Brajbhasha documents. What Irfan Habib and Tarapad Mukherjee have made possible is for us to bring that Yamuna and that Ganga together, so that we can get a sense of the output of that time in a much more richer fashion than we could ever have done if we didn't have those documents from the Mughal record at hand. And they're even different from the kinds of document that we get from Abul Fazl and the like. Large accounts of what's going on at court. No, these are records of transactions that happen right there on the spot. It's an amazing thing. And if I could just say one more thing, it's also amazing the way that the authors, especially Irfan Habib, actually present them to us. His English is so clear that he does not stand in the way of the reader at any point. He's just offering what he has read. And the candor with which he speaks is often remarkable. His attention to detail, so he tells you when a va is written and it's meant to be read as va and not ba, that a dot is added. Imagine someone telling you that kind of detail. Or, you discover all sorts of things just reading through the paging sort of at random through the text that you might never have suspected. For instance, the existence of a wine dealer in the Vrindavan area in the course of the 16th century. They were just hearing from Srivat's Goswami. Well, actually not. He appeared in a class of mine. So there's kind of resistance to the fact that we have, beer parties going on now in Braj, thanks to so many Delhiites making a visit. But there was a wine merchant right there in 16th century Vrindavan as well. These kinds of details help us to get a sense of what it was really like to be there at that time. And just one more example before, if I may. This happens to be on page 177, where this is at the end of the chapter about how the village of Arit came to be Radhakund. There's a whole chapter on that. So out by Mount Govardhan. And then after the chapter is done, Irfan gives us an addendum. He says, on a fresh reading of the documents, an interesting fact has come to light. So he gives us the whole argument, and then we see Irfan thinking on the spot. And he says, mention is made of a certain Narayan Bhatt in the Persian, which he says is probably, that would be Narayan Bhatt. And then he says, I think this actually may be Narayan Bhatt, the very person who wrote the Braj Bhakti Vilas, which provides this marvelous geography or landscape of the Braj country in the 16th century itself. So Irfan comes back on his own writing at a later point and says, wait, I have a new idea. This could be the very property that has to do with the Narayan Bhatt who gave us that story. So it's a beautiful example of how different kinds of textual media and life stories can come together, even in the mind of a great scholar like Irfan Habib. It's a fabulous book.
Right, sir. Thank you for such an explanation. Let me ask you about the importance of Braj area and the importance of Vrindavan, because sometimes Vrindavan is supposed to be the spiritual capital of India. So would you just explain a little on that? Irfan Habib and Tarapat Mukherjee only deal with the Mughal story of it. But would you say that this region had its importance from the Bhakti point of view, even in the period prior to the Mughals, or not?
It's an excellent question, and I think a very hard one to answer. What we do know is that the built Vrindavan only occurred in the time of Akbar. We also know, of course, that the great road connecting Agra to Delhi was built in the time of the Suris. But that too was in the middle of a Mughal reign. Babur had already come and then he departed. Then we have the Suris. Then once again we have the Mughals coming back with Akbar. So certainly it's a complicated story. We're always told that it would certainly have to be true that when the Lord Chaitanya came to Vrindavan, it would have been early in the 16th century. So in a certain way, that's outside the Mughal envelope. But the records that we have very largely speaking, almost entirely are from the Mughal period, and certainly the buildings are a part of what I would want to call Mughal Bhakti. So you would know better than I wish we had better records for the earlier periods. It certainly wasn't a blank period at all. But I think it's hard not to feel that this is a Mughal story. Even the date 1535, which is when Rup Goswami is supposed to have become the first Adhikari at the first temple of Govindadev, that's actually inside the Mughal envelope. So for me, in any case, I think it's very important to recognize that historically speaking, and even today, the story of Braj is a story that has to do with the Mughals. And that makes Braj into an administratively and religiously plural place in a way that we may not always appreciate, because Vrindavan, of course, is very largely speaking a Hindu site. But it's a Hindu site in the middle of a Mughal polity. There would be no built Vrindavan if there had not been Agra and Delhi, and then Lahore and Kabul, as a matter of fact, as the two capital areas that provide a contrast to and a context for the development of this Van. Otherwise, it would still be a Van.
Last week when we were talking to Srivat Goswami ji, he talked about two things. One, Vaad Nahi Samvad. That is the type of the slogan which he spoke about. And he also pointed out that, the development at Vrindavan, or for that matter, the whole of this, culture which came to exist, was in fact a dialogue between, you can say a tripartite Leela. That is what his words were. A tripartite Leela between Goswamis, Rajputs, and Akbar. So, I mean, that is what you are also talking about, and that is possibly what Irfan Habib and Tharapat Mukherjee, through their documents, also talked about. That it is the samanvay between the Mughal state, the Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who, according to Srivat Goswami, when he came to this region, he put his finger on the barren land, and then the grants which were given by the Mughals, and ultimately in the chapter, I think the first chapter of Irfan Habib's book, where the administration of the Mughals in this region has been dealt with. So, as you rightly pointed out, that the whole development at Vrindavan was something which started from the period of Akbar onwards, or from the coming of Sri Chaitanya in this region.
We look to, I think that's all absolutely right insofar as I understand, but if we look to that slightly earlier moment, when earlier than Akbar, when Rup Goswami and Sanatan Goswami come to Braj, when we begin to, so we could take the concept of Samvad and we could think, well, what kind of Samvad was going on inside the lives of those very people? Chaitanya himself, there's no Mughal record or any kind of record of Chaitanya's actually being in Braj, apart from the Gaudiya biographies of Chaitanya, which very importantly were made in the Mughal period. But for Rupa and Sanatan, we know that they were officials at the court of Hussain Shah of Gaur. So think about that. And they had, of course, Persian names. Rupa was the Vir Khas, the sort of private secretary, and Sanatan was Sadar Malik. So it's not an accident that these, the inner Samvad, surely they could speak some Braj Bhasha to be able to communicate with ordinary people, but they certainly had Persian. at their beck and call. They had whole Persian-speaking identities at the court of Hussein Shah. So already in those founding figures, you have a kind of inner samvad that you might not suspect if you were looking at their published works. When I say published, their written works in Sanskrit. It's very important. This is the kind of thing that Irfan and Tarapat have made us aware of, that the background for the production of those great theological works is a background that is not just Sanskrit speaking, but also Persian speaking. And the financial arrangements that made their success possible were arrangements that depended upon a Persian speaking court.
Right, sir. Yeah. Apart from this, this whole development of the Chaitanya sect, through which all this was happening, your work, in fact, on Surdas shows that there is another aspect in the Braj region, which is also being done, the Braj of Surdas and his Braj Bhasha. Would you like to say something on this aspect? I mean, naturally, this is something which is not taken up by Professor Habib and Tarapat Mukherjee.
That's true. But their inspiration was always there for me. And let me tell you why. So I'm reaching for this Bible once again. Irfan Habib and Tarapat Mukherjee, but especially Irfan, I believe, is a man of great courage when it comes to telling us something about the status of the documents that we're looking at. In a footnote that has made a huge difference to my scholarly life, that footnote appears on where? In this book, it appears on page 63, if anyone is looking, page 63, number 16. He tells us in that note that two of the firmans that were published by Javeri some time back in a book that purported to give us firmans to the leaders of the Vallabh Sampradaya, to the Tilakayat Maharaj Shris from early times, are collected in this book. But Irfan points out that two in that collection, Firmans 4 and 5, as they're numbered there, actually must be forgeries. Forgeries. And forgeries appear elsewhere in their book as well. It's not something that could just happen within the Vallabh Sampradaya, it also happened in the Gaudiya Sampradaya. He gives on page 89 a whole appendix called Note on Two Forged Farmans of Akbar, and they are both farmans that have to do, in fact, with Rup Goswami. So, why? We were talking about facts before. Here we're being given by a scholar who is able to read these records the reason why we should doubt this whole set of documents, and there are others that appear in the book. And he gives us, the Vallabhite ones, he's worried about the quality of the writing, he's worried about the titles, the Quran, and he's worried about what he calls the ignorance of the scribe as to the simple requirement that a farman had to begin with 2 half lines. Show both documents to answer. 2 half lines. Now, maybe he was copying from an earlier document, but this document has to be what he calls a forgery. Why did that matter for me? I appreciate his historical courage to be able to sift documents that seem to have been composed when they were from documents which claim to have been composed at an earlier date than they were. That had a very big impact on me because as I found myself learning about Surdas and the history which has been ascribed to him, I found myself having to doubt what I was reading. So that deals especially with Vallabhacharya. You would know that the great story goes, as retold in the Surasti Varta, which became a part of the Chaurasi Vaishnavanti Varta, that they met at a place called Goghat on the Yamuna, of course, not far from Agra, but on the way up to Mathura. And at that place, we are told, Sur was given an initiation by Vallabhacharya, in the course of which Vallabhacharya communicated to him in a mystical fashion the entirety of the Bhagavata Purana. So we are to understand that all that Sur composed was a kind of Bhasha version of the Bhagavata Purana. But what's the evidence for that? There's a remarkable passage which tries to relate a version of one of the best known poems of Surdas to what Vallabha says in his commentary on the Bhagavat. But it takes a lot of, how should I say, fancy footwork to make that happen. I won't go into details, but I just want to say that the whole question that I've had about whether Surdas actually was a pupil of Vallabha arises from this kind of carefully looking at what the documents themselves actually are. I think if you would look in this whole book, you will find mention of Vallabhacharya actually only once, and it's not because he figures in a document. It's because of what Irfan is bringing as context. So the absence of Vallabha in this entire set of documents is quite remarkable. Of course, we're dealing with a Chaitanyite trove, but we're dealing with administrative records, that famous moment in 1595, where the Gaudiyas were given by the court of Akbar the sort of the okay to regularize temple donations on the part of the state. So what I want to say is that this courage to question the status of a document is a courage that a historian actually needs. I think Surdas was not a pupil of Vallabhacharya. The Sur Sagar came to be organized according to the Bhagavata Purana only in the 18th century. The earlier documents give no indication of that. I do think that Sur probably knew the Bhagavat. Certain poems show that to be the case. But the Sur Sagar as a whole is not a translation of the Bhagavat. It is Sur's own poetry. And there's no mention of Vallabha or any sense that Vallabha would have mattered there. The famous texts that are cited by the Vallabha Sampradaya, the Pushtimarg, as creating a connection between Sur and Vallabha are only texts that occur in Vallabhite sources. They do not appear elsewhere in the corpus. So that kind of historical courage to go back and say, okay, what do we know and who was this? I hope that that is worth doing. For me, Sur is a poet of Braj Bhasha, broadly speaking. He says nothing of his guru, and I think his guru probably doesn't matter. His guru was the Lord Krishna. That is who Surdas was. So in that spirit of questioning later formulations about what Braj was, a matter of sampradayas, I'm not so sure. I think it was something much closer to the ground in the 16th century, over which the Mughal state watched.
Right, sir. One thing which somehow I haven't, I'm no expert of this field and I have not read much on this. In spite of that, my feeling is that Surdas represents much more the public perception than what the makers of Gobind Dev temple or the Chaitanya sect represented. Because Surdas is one of those who is actually not getting any remunerations from the state in any fashion. Would I be correct to say that?
Well, there is actually a Surdas who appears in the Mughal accounts, but I think it is not our Surdas. He is said to be the son of one, if I recall. Ramdas, it doesn't figure. So there is a Surdas who is mentioned among the musicians of the Mughal court, but I think it's very unlikely that it should be ours. Charlotte Vaudeville tried to make a case, but she made that case on the basis of a whole series of Surdas poems that actually do not show up in the early manuscripts. So I think you're right that Surdas is apart from the court. But does that mean that he is singing at the temple of Govardhanath, that's to say Srinachi at Mount Govardhan, or in Gokul? No. Yes, of course he's singing to, the Makhanchor. But that doesn't mean that he is a worshipper of Sri Navnita Priyaji as ensconced in Gokul. That's a story that the Vallabhites, I want to say invented, maybe invented for good reason, so as to give context in their own minds for who this Surdas was. But to take your description, I think of Sur as being a much broader poet. And in terms of the common man's poet, that I can't say. Some of his poetry is easy to understand, and some of his poetry is extremely difficult to understand. So I think we're dealing with a poet here who had enormous range. And by the way, we have more than one kind of account of who he was. When we get to Bhikharidas in the 18th century with his Kavi Nirnaya, Sur is mentioned right alongside the great Premakyan poets. Muslim poets. And in a text called the Afsane-i-Shahan, written by one Muhammad Kabir, we don't know exactly when, but sometime during the period of Jahangir, he's described as performing for Islam Shah. Now, maybe this too is not quite history, but what's interesting is that when he appears there, he appears alongside the great Premakyan poets. So let's be careful about thinking that we know where Sur was performing. We don't know. It may well have been in a temple setting, or it may well have been in a more courtly setting. And if it was in a more courtly setting, he may well have found himself surrounded by Muslim poets and Muslim hearers in a way that usually we don't tend to think.
When you mentioned this book Chaurasi Vaishnava Ki Varta, there, I just went through the translation of this work, and there are a number of episodes where it is alleged that these Vaishnava saints, they went to meet Akbar. But Akbar, in fact, invited them to meet him, but they refused to meet Akbar. When Srivats Goswami ji was talking about Vrindavan, he said the Goswamis and others invited Akbar to come over to Vrindavan, but actually he never came in spite of promising that he would be coming. So, there are two diverse, in Chaurasi Vaishnava Ki Varta, it is as if, Akbar wants to meet them, but the saints refuse. But here, the legend is that they were inviting Akbar, and Akbar did not come over to Vrindavan.
Right. Well, this whole set of stories about who comes to be with Akbar is a wonderful set. I would call it a trope. We're not talking about history here. We're talking about a familiar story about the relationship between dunya and Virat. And what should be the relationship between spiritual power and worldly power. So it relates to the Chistis, actually, and so forth, in relation to the state. I think it's very unlikely that Surdas appeared before Akbar. The story is a great one. Akbar asks for a composition to be offered about him, and he says, no, you're not my lord. I write my poems for, in that context, Govardhanachi instead. Or Mirabai comes. I don't think so. This is just a trope. It's a trope that tells us something important about the relationship between worldly power and spiritual power. But we're not hearing history here. We're hearing stories that have a different kind of, let's say, eternal value, but they're not to be taken as historical fact. Hence, it's no wonder that the Mughal records contain no mention of the appearance of any of these poets before Akbar. Now there's Tansen. Tansen, of course, was very important and appears in the quarterly records, no question about that. Then we have the story of how Tansen became the musical instructor of Haridas, and the lineage goes down to the Bihari temple. But I'm sorry to say that although that's a well-believed and well-beloved story, we don't have any evidence that that's really was historically the case. Even the beautiful painting that shows Tansen, Haridas, and Krishna together is an 18th century or even 19th century painting. It doesn't go back further.
In one of the recent, and this is my last, query before I would request you to show some of your slides to further elucidate on this theme. Just one last query to you, and that is that recently Professor Romila Thapar has published a book where she, the Voices of Dissent, an essay, in which she talks about Muslim Vaishnavas or Krishna Bhakts in the Mughal Empire. Your take on that?
Well, there's just no question but the fact that they existed, and they existed in very high places. Brahim, was one of the inner circle of Akbar's court. There's no question but that he was also a poet of Krishna. Ras Khan, of course he was a Krishna Bhakta. What Romila, I think, is wanting to say in that, the great Romila Thapar, what she's wanting to say, among other things, in her writing there, is that they did not describe themselves as Mughal Vaishnavas. They were Krishna Bhaktas. There were no, she's trying to say that these great boundaries that we have nowadays, where a Vaishnava is something over here and a Mughal is something over here, those boundaries did not exist in the 16th and 17th century. There was this ability to move freely, more freely perhaps, in response to one's own poetical, let's say, urges. So I'm completely with her there. And we can very well imagine Rahim or Ras Khan being at the Mughal court and singing their kabit, to take the case of Rahim, in the presence of the emperor or other courtiers. Why not?
Right, sir. Would you like to show us some of your slides through which to, tell us more about this Braj region?
We've been talking all along today about Bhoom in Mughal times. I'd like to say a word about Bhoom in our times before I sign off. And maybe I could start with January 8th, 2020 in Delhi, when I was at the India International Center for the launch of a book that I've recently completed called Krishna's Playground, Vrindavan in the 21st Century. So again, this is a note not just about Bhoom in Mughal times, but Bhoom in our times. The purpose of that book was to give a picture of how Vrindavan has changed in the many years since I've been visiting it on a regular basis. Those years started back in the mid-1970s 70s, and parts of Vrindavan are very much now as they were then. Here's the courtyard to the Radharaman temple, which is home to the Chaitanya Goswamis that are particularly associated with Srivats Goswami, who regaled us with his understanding of Bhoom last time. And here, of course, is the Radharamanshi himself, very much as he was actually in the Mughal period itself. It wasn't hard to make a jump in those times, the 1970s, from what I saw around me to what had been depicted in texts and in artwork that I had seen, namely the evocation of the Ras Lila of Krishna. You see the music of it right there on your screen right now. And indeed, the Ras Lilas were performed in more than one season in Braj, then as they still are today. But a great deal else has changed. The Parikrama Marg in those days was a thing of Braj ki Raj. If you went out for a parikrama of Vrindavan in those days, you were touching the Braj ki Raj itself. You were not wearing your shoes. You were walking just with bare feet. Look at how it is today. It's been completely paved over. Parikrama Marg is now one of the major arteries in town and entirely paved, but for a tiny, tiny section around Keshi Ghat. Imagine that those changes can take place in our own lifetime. And the greatest change of all, perhaps, is the coming of ISKCON to Vrindavan, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. This Krishna Balaram temple, which is a major focus for the visits of pilgrims and visitors to Vrindavan today, weekenders from Delhi, this temple was established at the very limits of the town that I came to know when I arrived there in the 70s. It was inaugurated in 1976 with the Samadhi of Prabhupada, A.C. Bhakti Vedanta Acharya. And it is a major focus of pilgrimage today. Then it was very much a matter of gringos like myself, light-seeing folks who had brought Krishna consciousness from New York and associated places back to Vrindavan. Now it's very much more a native site, an Indian site, as you can see in this selfed vision of the temple as it is today. Other parts of the town have changed just as measurably. All of what I'm about to show you is beyond the Parikrama Marg, in a place that was entirely one in the days that I first knew it, called Raman Reti. There it was, the Reti itself. Here's the Prem Mandir, which, as I think I mentioned, compares itself to the Taj Mahal in the numbers of visitors that it attracts on any given day. And as one moves farther out on the Chatikara Road, beyond ISKCON, beyond the Prem Mandir, you'll pass the Sri Jwaladham ashram, which evokes the presence of Jwalamukhi from the Himalayas and begins to give a sense of how the Vrindavan today has become a part of national Hindu self-representation in a way that it was not when I first arrived. At that point, it was very much strictly a Vaishnava place. Nowadays, of course, it's still Vaishnava, but Vaishnava in an obvious context of broad Hindu religiosity as we understand it today. Here, of course, is a representation at the Jwaladham, Jwaladham ashram of Sri Krishna lifting up Mount Govardhan. And you'll see that some giraffes have been brought in from the greater world to help him with that task. I love the playfulness of this. The Leela of Krishna has not disappeared from Braj. Here you can see it at night. And if you happen to come with a kid in the course of the day, it's a great thing, because for the kids especially, and as a feature of the Leela nature of Vrindavan, you can take your child up there to take a look at the helicopter that has landed on top of Mount Govardhan, the imagined Mount Govardhan of this very site. Keep your eye on that helicopter. Helicopters are not actually foreign to Vrindavan itself, as one encounters it today. Another indication of how Vrindavan has been surrounded by the, one might say, syndicated Hinduism of our present time is the presence of this 52-foot Hanumanji at a Chitrakoot ashram just across the street from some of the sites that we've just seen. This Hanumanji you could see in Delhi and in many places around India today. And perhaps most telling of all, here we have Vaishno Devi, having been transplanted from her natal place in the Himalayas, so to speak, to take her presence in Vrindavan as a kind of Dwarpal. If you were to approach Vrindavan on National Highway 2, you would come down the Chatikara Road, and hers would be the first presence that you would see, a massive presence on the landscape. So once again, a sign of how Vrindavan has been enveloped in a more comprehensive Hindu religiosity that is familiar to us from many places in India today. When I launched this book, Krishna's Playground, in Delhi in the beginning of this year, 2020, I had thought that my main purpose was just to try to give a picture of how Vrindavan has changed, how rapidly it's changed in the time since I've been going there, and what those changes have meant. A major feature of that would be how Vrindavan has really become a part, so to speak, of megalopolitan Delhi, with its new high-rises built all over the part of town that we've just been talking about, the new part of Vrindavan. Going the wrong way, I beg your pardon. So very different from the Braj that was there when I came in the 1970s. I mention this because when I opened this vista to a small audience of people at the IIC in Delhi, I was finding myself in a moment that had changed even more recently than the description of change that I had been trying to describe in the book itself. Changed because of the anti-Muslim policies of certain members of the Bharatiya Janata Party, and we feel it especially in UP. These were the days when the Citizenship Amendment Act had recently been passed. Everyone was feeling the pressure of that in Delhi, especially Muslims, but also those who have treasured the, let's call it secular or multi-religious heritage of India as a whole. This was a time also when JNU was under fire by the BJP administration. I have many close friends at JNU, and in fact, the person who was serving as the host for that launch event was Purushottam Agarwal, who was for many years professor of Hindi at JNU. How could we think of anything else but the way in which Muslims have been othered by Hindu majoritarianism in our time? What does Vrindavan have to do with that? If we think of Vrindavan as India's spiritual capital, and many people do feel that, then we have to think back to the Vrindavan that we've been talking about today. The Vrindavan that is rooted in a very different history, a history of Mughal, Hindu, Mughal Kachwaha cooperation, in which the landscape of Braj was holy, so to speak, not just to those who worshipped it, who came to it as Hindus after the pattern of the Lord Chaitanya, but to many other people, including those associated with the Mughal state itself. So here, once again, is the parikrama as it seemed to me when I came there. You can see that the Van, the wilderness of Vrindavan, is still very much around us. And this is Srivats Goswami, whom you see on the left, accompanied by our dear friend, oh my gosh, how is it possible? Asim Krishnadas, who, alas, has by now passed away. You may remember that, I think I mentioned this earlier, that Akbar, actually, the Emperor Akbar, made a special donation to a Faman in protection of the peacocks of Vrindavan. They're very hard to find in today's Vrindavan because the monkeys have chased them away. But back 50 years ago, that simply wasn't the case. They've come back in the era of COVID, actually. But when you see this peacock, I want you to see the fact that Akbar himself extended his hand toward peacocks like this when he set aside Vrindavan as its own special unit of jurisdiction in Braj. You can still see the Van, the Vrindavan, that's to say the wilderness that is a part of Vrindavan's name. You can still see it on the outskirts of Vrindavan, among the buildings that I've just been describing, but it's not insignificant that where you see it here, you're seeing it alongside the Chatikara Road itself. Very little of this Van remains. It's actually framed by the great real estate development that has engulfed this side of Vrindavan. But you know, we can think of that road in a different way too. After all, while Vrindavan was certainly more a Van and was treasured for being a Van in the day of its being built, and was treasured in that guise by the Mughal state and the Kachwaha power that worked with the Mughal state, still it was part of a larger configuration in which urban realities surrounded Braj. Agra and Delhi were, after all, connected by the great highway that had been built by Sher Shah Suri in the middle of the 16th century. And so highways were not alien to the Van of Vrindavan. The difference today is that that Van has almost disappeared from sight. We were reminded by Srivats Goswami last week, and we've talked of it again today, of the special symbolic role that the temple of Govindadev played in that whole process. Here it was built from the pink sandstone that was used at Fatehpur Sikri, which required a special dispensation from the Mughal state, because otherwise that sandstone was reserved for Mughal buildings as such. Here it was being extended into the envelope of Krishna worship that was so dear to the Kachwahas. Here's the inside of that structure, a remarkable structure actually, because it evokes that great sense of arched domes that are so important to the building of mosques and other public buildings in the era of Mughal Bhakti, as I want to call it. And here you see Srivats himself speaking with some of his Manyatri devotees who have come to the temple of Govindadev with him. If you were to go a little further out with Srivatsji as he takes his devotees for a sort of a look at the Van of his Manyatra, you'll see that he will not forget to take you to the Samadhi of the great Brajbhasha poet Naskhan. His name betrays him, of course, as being Mughal by birth, but he is also a Krishna Bhakta. And in fact, we don't know much about his Mughal Bhakti, so to speak, or his Muslim Bhakti. What we know of him is his Krishna Bhakti. Ah, yes, and this famous set of dohas is recalled. तो वही रस खान बसों ब्रज गोकुल गाँव के ग्वार में जो पशु हूँ तो कहाँ बस मेरो चरों नित नंद की धेनु मंझार में पावन हो. And it goes on. You can see his devotion to the Braj country. Here then is his Samadhi, located on the eastern side of the river Yamuna, and Srivats is taking me along with his Banyatris to that site there. You see him with his very familiar microphone taking his devotees back into the history of Braj. And here, as you recall, is the representation of the Govindadev temple that was made on the walls of the Bhojanshala of Raja Jai Singh of Amer, later Jaipur, named after him. So this is a sort of an artist's representation of how the Govindadev temple looked in the day when its shikara was intact. The story of how it came not to be intact is not yet a story that we actually know how to tell, though the Pandas of Vrindavan tell it with great confidence. They say Aurangzeb destroyed this. It may be, in fact, that Aurangzeb was responsible for the dismantling of the shikara, But it's significant that he maintained the rest of the temple. And if it was Aurangzeb who took that shikara down, then surely it was in response to the fact that Brajvasis and Kachwatas had protected his political rival, Shivaji. So I think it would be fair to say that this was a political act rather than a religious act, though of course it had an effect on a religious building. But I think it was not Aurangzeb the Muslim who did this, but Aurangzeb the emperor who destroyed that shikara, who brought it down, if indeed he was responsible for that act. It's still a mystery. And I take you back to what Srivats had to say about that last week. Also glad to look forward to the fact that Dick Eaton, Richard Eaton, is going to be coming into this seminar in a week's time to talk more about this very, how shall I say, involvement of the Mughal state with its Hindu citizens. So just to recall where we've been, I've been making an appeal, a hope that today's people, as they think about Braj Bhoom in present time, will remember that Braj Bhoom in Mughal times was a site that was made possible by religious plurality and the involvement in state politics of a number of actors, some of whom were Muslim by background and some of whom were Hindu. We would not have Vrindavan, the spiritual capital of India today, had it not been for that cooperation. And you'll recall that we talked about the poet Surdas, and I raised some questions about whether he should be thought of as a pupil of Vallabhacharya. I think not. He is Sur, as you would encounter him if you Googled him on Wikipedia today. And actually this representation, where we see the poet with his ekta and his clackers singing to the child Krishna, is a sort of reverse representation of this depiction of Krishna with Bal Krishna with a very old Surdas, which was made by Brajvasi and Sons, the studio in Mathura, also located in Mumbai, as it would have been called at that point. So you see this wonderful, the aged poet of Braj addressing himself to an enraptured Sri Krishna. But once again, if we look closely at the poetry of Sur, and particularly if we separate him from that supposed sectarian rubric into which history has come to funnel him, that's to say the rubric supplied by the Vallabh Sampradaya, we meet a Sur who is open to his not just Hindu surroundings, but Mughal surroundings and Muslim surroundings as well. Here is Sur as he is depicted in about 1700 or 1710 in Udaipur. Notice his very interesting hat. Notice that he's not carrying an ektar at all. He has his janjiras, and he's part of a scene, a Braj scene, that is being performed at the royal court in Mewar. I mentioned to you one of the poems that is illustrated at Mewar at that point in time, and we'll come to it in just a moment. That's the Tazi poem. But I wanted to give you just a little bit of a sense also of an evocation that Sur provides for the river Yamuna. Just a little taste of the language of Surdas as we know it in the poems that can be very firmly dated to the 16th century, unlike so many that fill the Sur Sagar today. The Sur Sagar that we know is a work of agglutination. It grew with time because more and more poets wanted to take the name of Sur as they gave a chop to their own poems of their own composition. But here is a poem that we can actually date to the 16th century. It appears in manuscripts that have very definitely a 16th century base. It's addressed to the Yamuna. Kalindi Keso Kinari. This is not Keso in the sense of Kesa, but Keshav. That's to say Krishna. Kalindi Keso Kinyari, ki pyari. Nyari bhi hai, but pyari hai yahan pe. जैसे हम पर श्याम करत हैं Aisi kripa karhu to manyari. There's our yari. Jamuna jasaki rasi chahonjugu jamajeti jagaki mahatari. Sur, that's his chop. Sur buro kaba hunjani mano kaha karon yeh prakriti hamari. So we've been talking about Prakriti this whole time, the natural world of Braj, but here the poet takes Prakriti in a personal sense. Please forgive what I ever may have done. It's on account of my own nature, my own Prakriti. That's what makes me as I am. Then I want to show you the text of the Tazi poem, so to speak, this wonderful poem about peacocks sitting on peaks. Sikani sikarani chaditega sunayo birahani sunayo, I beg your pardon. Birahani sabadhana karahiyo liye pavasedala ayo. And here comes the crucial line. Badala ati banayate pavana tazi chadi chatak dekhayo, and on it goes. At the end, Surdasa samruttake vane Pranajata Birmayo. Surdas says they remember what he'd said, and the breath within them stops, slows to a stop. These poor Virahanis who find themselves confronted by Kamdev. But the crucial word in this poem, you remember, is Tazi. Those, I think specifically, certainly Arab horses, and would have been a part of the Mughal army, actually. And here, the metaphorical realm is described on the left, as you recall, and the real world attack of Kama in the absence of Krishna is felt on the right and felt by the poet, whose visual signature we now see. Again, this reminds us of the temple of Govindadev because of its embeddedness in a Mughal Krishna culture. Here is Srivatsa explaining the significance of this temple to me and other of his devotees as we went to the temple of Govindadev, and I would want to point out that this is the culminating point for his Banyatra, when he takes his devotees to so many places around the Ban of Vrindavan and its surroundings. He wants to end with the Govindadev temple because, as we learned last week, he cherishes this temple as a symbol of dialogue that is in danger of being forgotten in today's Hindu majoritarian India. He recalls the crucial importance of Raja Man Singh for this temple. Without Raja Man Singh, it surely would not have existed. And the fact that Akbar, the Emperor Akbar, was behind the entire project. If somewhat indirectly, and yet his name is mentioned in the inscriptions that we actually see on site. I like this particular depiction of Akbar because it shows a couple of gringos like me, a couple of foreigners, dressed in their strange dark clothes. So many of us in New York wear black all the time. These would be, I suppose, the Jesuits who came to the court of Akbar. And as we know, the Deen-e-Ilahi was not just about welcoming Jesuits into the presence of the Khas Log, but representatives of other religious communities as well. It was self-consciously a religiously plural vision of what religion ought to mean. And now, let me turn finally to the structure that we've been talking about earlier, the Vrindavan Chandrodaya Mandir, which is going to change the landscape of Vrindavan very substantially, if indeed it is built. We have a great hole in the ground for its foundations at the extremity of Vrindavan, not so very far actually from the Vaishno Devi temple. What will this structure say about Vrindavan? We remember that in the literature that forecast it, It was said that if you go up to the top of the Chandrodaya Mandir, you would be able to look across the Braj landscape and see as far on a clear day as to the Taj Mahal. One hopes that that's a point of just general reference for where the Braj country stops. You know, the Taj Mahal is a marker of the Braj country in its extremity. But one's worry is that one is here looking down on the Taj in a way, or that's the danger, in a way that Yogi Adityanath has looked down on the Taj as a representative of the Mughal presence behind Braj culture. It's that we hope to remove from consciousness. Note that the Taj Mahal is built on the banks of the Yamuna. That same river ties the heartland of Braj, Mathura, and Vrindavan to Agra. It's the same river. It's more than the river in some ways. That is half of the Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb, or rather that Tehzeeb actually is contained in a sense of what this river ought to mean. In speaking about the Vrindavan Chandrodaya Mandir, I have not mentioned yet actually a very important part of what it represents. When ISKCON of Bangalore developed the plan to build the Chandrodaya Mandir, its first step, very much to its credit, was to establish there a branch of Akshay Patra, the inexhaustible vessel which provides free meals to kids in various parts of India at large, including Vrindavan. Here you have a representation in Vrindavan, at the Vrindavan Chandrodaya Mandir, of the Akshay Patra program. And indeed, the kitchen that feeds Akshay Patra is located right there on the VCM site, the Vrindavan Chandrodaya Mandir site. Here's one of the trucks that takes meals out into Vrindavan and into the Braj country, just as they do in many other places around India today, including Bangalore itself. There was an occasion earlier last year, 11th of February 2019, where the 3 billionth meal was going to be served to school children all over the country. And that was going to be marked, celebrated at Vrindavan itself, and the Prime Minister himself flew in from Delhi for that occasion. You remember I mentioned helicopters? He certainly came in a helicopter, and in fact, 2 additional heliports had to be constructed on the grounds of the Chandrodaya Mandir so that the Prime Minister could come down from Delhi, the Chief Minister could come across from Lucknow, and I suspect that the 3rd helicopter was filled with the security squad that would have been necessary to keep them safe as they came. I don't know that for a fact, just speculation, but there were 3 heliports on the scene. I was present in the crowd that was waiting for the Prime Minister to appear and for the event to begin. Some 11,000 people. It was a fantastic gathering. And here are the guys who happened to be in the row just behind me. We're all waiting here for the arrival of the Prime Minister, which is going to be shown to us on a big screen. We're inside a structure. We won't be able to see the helicopter itself land, but we can see it all happen on a big screen that makes the event available to us visually. There was such palpable excitement at that moment when Narendra Modi was going to arrive in Vrindavan and to share his own sense of charisma with the crowd that had gathered for that occasion. This was certainly a Hindu crowd. There's no question about that. But what I very much hope, and in celebrating an initiative that was made by Hindus, by the Hindus of Bangalore initially, but now all around the country, and indeed at the Vrindavan Chandrodaya Mandir itself. What I hope is that in the course of the celebration of that Hinduness in service of the nation, these guys behind me don't feel that they have to other the Muslims and members of other religious communities who live near them, and indeed in Vrindavan itself. We have a lovely 18th century account of how, in fact, Muslim fakirs lived in Vrindavan. There certainly are Muslims still living in Vrindavan, as there are Sikhs and as there are Christians by birth. It's a Hindu town, but it's a complexly Hindu town. And its history points to the fact that it was built on the foundation of what Srivats wants to call dialogue between religious communities involved in a polity that will make room for all. So my hope for the Braj Bhoom of today is that it will carry that heritage onward, not just today, but well into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Khalid. Thank you very much for giving us your time and explaining to us those points which we would ordinarily have missed. Uh, Naturally, let me say that these programs are directed towards those who are non-experts of the field. Uh, Naturally, these aspects of bhakti, uh, these aspects which scholars like you or Irfan Habib deal with are difficult to understand as far as the general public is concerned, general masses are concerned. Our attempt through these programs is that they are made simple so that people who are not experts of history may also be able to understand the world, how it is developing around them. Thank you very much. And dear viewers, let me once again inform you that next Sunday we would be interacting with another scholar, Professor Richard Eaton, who would be with us, and he would be discussing his recent work, his book on Indian history, which was published some time back. I hope that before you join us once again next Sunday, please go through Eaton's work so that you may be able to follow what he has to tell us. Thank you very much.